Hey, extra historians, welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the things that we left out, the stuff we got wrong. And it's maybe good to feed your army. I'm Rob, I'm the head writer of Extra History, and we're talking about the Crimean War today. And I'm just going to quickly jump in because we have actually a lot of updates we got to get through. A little bit of housekeeping. Of course, Lies is made possible by our Patreon patrons. Everyone thinks that's funny when I say it, and I'm going to continue saying it because I'm like a second grader that way. Thanks so much for letting us show that history is a conversation and that nobody has the full story and everyone has decided to tell things a certain way. I want to talk about, we have some really cool new merch on our Nebula store. I've got one of the new Zoe shirts on. We've got, Extra History Zoe and Extra Mythology Zoe and literature and gaming. We have monthly pins. Don't be like me and start late on these and miss some because they do go out of rotation. Right now, I just got the Walpole one, and I'm waiting for the Joan of Arc pin, which is the Get 'em Joan of Arc. And of course, we have Zoe's, which I always have to steal back from my kids when I am filming a video with it, and mugs and things like that. And we're going to have some new stuff coming out soon. There's a Walpole shirt on pre-order that's not out yet, but that's exciting. We are part of the Nebula First program, so if you are a Nebula member, you get to our episodes a full week early. Our History of Buddhism series has started that already, and we have a really neat History of Dungeons & Dragons over on the Extra Credits Gaming channel. Definitely check that out if you are interested in Dungeons & Dragons or even just game design. It's really interesting watching. Our recommended reading for this series is Crimea by Orlando Figes, also sold as Crimea the Last Crusade, Crimea the Great Crimean War by Trevor Royal. There's a series of Osprey Publishing books. I'm not going to name authors individually because it would take too long, but Balaclava 1854, Inkerman 1854, British Army of the Crimea, the Russian Army of the Crimean War, Ottoman Armies 1820 to 1914. There are probably others I forgot. I was very heavily into the Osprey rabbit hole on this series. There's a really cool documentary. It's an older documentary, but it's still very good, called Crimean War, A Clash of Empires. It was made in 1997 as a Channel 4 documentary. It's very good, though, and it relies a lot on diaries and primary sources. And is spectacular at, putting together a sensory feel of the conflict as well. Just generally, I wanted to say, I studied the Crimean War a little tiny bit when I was in college. I was doing European history, mostly British history, and it was mostly put in the context of what's called the mid-Victorian crises. Basically, in the middle of Queen Victoria's reign, Britain is just careening from crisis to crisis in the empire. Right after this is the Indian Mutiny of 1857, then there's the Zulu Wars and Boer War, and there's just hot spots popping up everywhere. China, that they're kind of stamping on emperors around the room, always worried about what's happening in the empire. So I more studied it as kind of a host of events, part of a collection of events. So I was really surprised how big it was. And genuinely, we could have done 3 or 4 series, one just focusing on supply and medicine, which I would have loved to do. Maybe in a future series, but Florence Nightingale, we can get into that a little more. We had a great YouTube comment. The Crimean War is really a case study of how important supplying is and the difficulty of taking care of an army. 2 opposing examples are the ways Britain and France conducted their campaigns. In this case, the British made so many wrong choices, their army was more in danger of the generals than of the Russians. I wouldn't necessarily say that, but one thing that I found very fascinating, the British and French differed heavily on this. The French were really encouraged to create solutions in the field and to forage and to build their own shelters and just make do with what's around. So, they get there and they don't have adequate shelter. And they're like, well, there's a stand of trees over there. Let's go cut it down, and that's shelter and fuel. The British don't do that. They're like, well, we have these tents and they're not really adequate. Let's ask the commissariat where our tents are. Let's ask the commissariat where our coal is. And they're very slow to adopt these kind of makeshift measures, whereas the French are just doing it from the start. And are actually pretty perplexed about why their British allies are not doing this. But it was a way of training the army of this idea of like, if you were in the field, you just make do with what you have. In a similar vein, the French have an actual system for feeding their army, whereas the British, it's not so much. The British are issued individual rations that they're supposed to prepare in the field with the coal the commissariat is giving them. But of course, the coal isn't arriving, and the British are left with all these kind of like raw ingredients. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? They're supposed to individually make their meals, whereas the French had designated people that were supposed to cook a large amount of food specifically for this unit, much more like we think of in a modern military. The French also had this class of women called Vivandières, which I really wish we could have talked about, who would follow the army and provide cooking, settling, medical care, resupply. They would sell wine to the troops. It's kind of the role Mary Seacole played, but like much more official, and the British were obsessed with these women. Like Roger Fenton photographs one very famously because they're like, who are these women? Why don't we have something like this? This looks like a really good thing, because they're also often frontline medical care. So if the French doctors are not keeping up, the Vivandières come in and they help out, bandage up wounds and things like that. Episode 1, a patron question from Peanut Tree 5000. This comment represents about 50% of the comments on the first episode. In the first episode, you pointed out that the Crimean War was called World War Zero because it was the first industrial war fought throughout the globe, but wouldn't the 7 Years' War suit that name better because it was global, even though it wasn't fully industrialized? So there's always going to be debate about what was the first World War. And though it's kind of understandable, it sort of misses the point of why historians play with this sort of language, the point that they're trying to prove with what's essentially a rhetorical tool. Personally, I'd say yes, like the 7 Years' War probably has a greater claim to being the First World War, but the way historians use it with regard to the Crimean War is that it's sort of a beta test for World War I. So not only do you have this wide array of participants and fighting across various places in Europe, but you also have alliances, patriotic fervor, mass media, technology, trench warfare. These are all elements that are going to be very important in the First World War, which are not really present in the 7 Years' War. So to me, when they say World War Zero, it's a way of reframing the Crimean War as a conflict presaging World War I, both in its scale and its feel. Notice they don't say this is the real First World War, like they sometimes do with the 7 Years' War. World War Zero, to me, is a fundamentally different term, right? It's about saying, like, this is sort of beta test World War I. A YouTube question, are you going to mention in the next episodes that also the Kingdom of Sardinia joined the side of France, UK, and the Ottomans? They took part in the conflict not because they were interested in controlling the East, but because they were looking for a powerful European ally who would help them against Austria during the Italian unification. Yeah, I decided to largely save that story for when we do a future unification of Italy series, which has been on my wish list for years, partially just because it's a period I think is very interesting. I don't know a ton about it myself, and often that is exciting to me. The idea of, oh cool, I get to kind of like go into the story that I don't really know and find out how to tell it. Actually, there's a lot of Italian history I'd like to do outside the kind of Roman Empire stuff we've done. Italy is fascinating. We did not have a lot of time for it by episode 5 also. You'll see later, I was just pulling stuff out of episode 5 willy-nilly to make the word count on the script. Like I said, this was a much bigger topic, actually, than I realized when I started. I do want to mention that when you actually look at what won this war, it's all about, like, low-casualty naval engagements, blockades, diplomacy, and if anything, the threat of, like, Sardinia and Austria and new powers entering the war is more decisive than anything else that, like, happens militarily in Crimea. So it's really interesting that, you know, this very bloody conflict in one area, like, is really solved more through maneuvering than military engagements. Episode 2, YouTube question. The British campaign up and down the Finnish coast was mostly a huge success, but there was one place that they were repulsed. Not a fortress, but the tiny village of Kokkola. There, local seal hunters ambushed a British landing party, driving the Brits off and capturing a landing craft. The boat was kept as a trophy and can still be seen in the center of the city today. Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that the Baltic campaign was totally without bloodshed, by the way. There were people killed, mostly Russian troops manning forts under bombardment. But you do have like little instances like this that are really fascinating, and again, like this, it was so big. Like I didn't even know about the Baltic Theater when I started reading about this, and I was like, oh, this is kind of the whole thing. This is a big deal. One thing we didn't also touch on as much as I would have liked is the war tourism aspect. This was a really big war for military tourism, and this Baltic campaign, you had English onlookers that just like came along to see it. And there's a really fascinating, if you watch that documentary, there's a really fascinating bit where an English clergyman who's following and is like treating these bombardments like a party, and he's just elated by what he's seeing, kind of like how we described Tolstoy. That's another reason I didn't take it out, because I knew we were going to talk about Tolstoy, and I didn't want it to be too much parallel. But then he goes inside this fortress that they've now captured and just sees the utter carnage that has resulted from this bombardment, and has a real kind of guilty conscience and personal test of who am I really like, and feels very sick and guilty. Someone said, you could make the argument that British press hasn't changed much since then. Good joke, but I do want to mention that William Howard Russell is not British, he's Irish. And this was actually part of his appeal. Much of the British infantry in particular was Irish at this time. And Russell was a very comfortable kind of milling with the ranks. And, he's kind of classic, stereotypical Irishman in that he's very convivial, he's very good at talking, and he often has like a bottle of whiskey with him, so he's drinking with the troops and learning all the stuff they're going through. And again, like when you think about Raglan saying he's like a foreign spy, like part of that probably has to do with his Irishness, right, and English attitudes toward the Irish during this time. Episode 3, patron question from Flubba Dubba. It's interesting that the French are seen as the competent force in Crimea when we already know that France being outclassed is what led to Napoleon III's fall during the war with Prussia. Does this reflect a loss of strength, or did the Prussians learn that much about how to use trains to crush your opponent from their observers in the American Civil War? I don't want to comment kind of forward about the Franco-Prussian War, partially because I haven't read up on it lately, so I don't want to get into waters I don't necessarily know a ton about or haven't been recently updated on. The French had a lot of recent field experience in Algeria, so they kept their skills sharp and continued to develop. I genuinely think that kind of like that experience of the revolution and Napoleon had really straightened out a lot of their issues with supply and medicine and things like that. Also, I think that the British winning the Napoleonic Wars kind of hurt them as far as military readiness. There can be a bit of a malaise that comes over a military when they win a giant victory and they can sort of rest on their laurels. And technologically, obviously, the British are not doing that. They have rifles, they have mini bullets, but there aren't a lot of lessons learned, and the military kind of degrades. This period after the Napoleonic Wars is considered like a little bit of a dark time for the British military. You don't have a lot of really great serving officers and things like that. And defeat often teaches lessons too. I do want to point out also that the Grand Crimean Railway, despite its name, when we look at pictures of it, is a very dinky little train. It is not very, if you're used to like military trains of the American Civil War, this is not that. It's small. Like, I don't think it could quite fit in this basement I'm filming at. We're at Extra Credits Mid-Atlantic right now. I'm visiting home. Yeah, it's not a large train. But it's adequate for what they needed, right? YouTube, small correction. The Zouaves were not Frenchmen recruited from Algeria, at least not after 1841. When the French arrived in Algeria, they started recruiting soldiers from the local population with a uniform inspired from the Algerian warriors, forming regiments of Zouaves. However, in 1841, the French army was reorganized and the recruitment for the Zouaves was restricted to Frenchmen. So during the Crimean War, the Zouaves were French from France. Yes, that is correct. And I understood that some were French recruited from Algeria, but I could be incorrect about that. My understanding was some were French colonials. Yeah, that was also something that I had to edit down significantly to make word count, and I could have created an error in editing too, which sometimes happens. I do want to mention their general that we talked about during Battle of the Alma that had stomach cancer. He passed away days after the battle. So that's, people asked, how do we know I have stomach cancer? Because he died like 3 days later. Another comment, I've heard historians say that if Wellington had been in Crimea, Raglan and the British commissariat would have swung from the gallows. I don't know who's to say he wouldn't have been just as hidebound. Wellesley would have been like 84, 85 years old at that point, and not exactly prime campaigning years. He died 2 years previously, I think. So, I don't know. I think people like to say that kind of thing, but I don't know if it's necessarily true. We had lots of requests for a Mary Sequel series. We already have one. It's great. You can watch it right here. I think it's here, actually. And it's 2 episodes. Slight correction at 224, you could indeed purchase a commission in the British Army, as Lord Cardigan did, but you could only do so up to the rank of lieutenant colonel. To achieve a rank higher than that, you would need either merit, seniority, or connections, or a combination of 2 or all 3 in some cases. I mean, we're talking about aristocrats, you know? Like, so, you know, connections, merit, seniority, these all kind of mean different things when you're talking about the British class system, in my opinion. I mean, look at Cardigan. He's the commander of the Light Brigade. He joins the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars in 1824. By 1830, he's a lieutenant colonel after purchasing commissions 4 times. He was only major for 3 months before buying his way up. 2 years later, he spends £35,000 to buy himself up to a colonel and command the 15th, the King's Hussars. So he bought essentially like command of this regiment. He didn't buy the rank of colonel. He's like purchasing the regiment itself. And even seniority and time served doesn't necessarily mean anything. You know, he commanded the 11th Light Dragoons for 2 years, and he spent only 4 weeks of that actually with the regiment. He was off shooting tigers and stuff in India. You know, he would take separate transports back because he didn't want to be with the men. So time served can mean some kind of iffy stuff too. I mean, he was dismissed by King William IV after a series of conflicts with his own officers, got reinstated because he had connections in court that were pulling strings. You know, between all this, Cardigan is also like in and out of Parliament, so he's doing other stuff. It's not like a modern military where he is a military officer and just a military officer. He has like side jobs and side trips, and even when you go through like, oh, you need seniority and like years served, there were ways to game that too. You know, there were people who enlisted their 2 and 3 year olds, you know, supposedly on ships when they weren't really on ships, so they could start building time in the Royal Navy toward promotions, right? So Thomas Cochrane, that was done for him when he was a kid, so that he had accelerated promotion. So all of this could be gamed in various ways. And then the curbs were like, they were more like kind of wink-wink curbs rather than real ones. You could never purchase commissions to the Royal Artillery or Royal Engineers, by the way, or the Royal Navy, which to me is kind of an admission that some roles are not fake it till you make it type of things and are too technical to be subjected to the purchase system, which doesn't look good for the purchase system, right? Episode 4, patron comment, that one. When did the British finally undertake reforms to their officer structure, if not in the wake of the Crimean War? Did they make it all the way to Flanders with the bought officerships, or to Dunkirk? Are those videos of Prince Harry running off to deploy in a helicopter mid-interview around because they never actually formally reformed the system of getting promoted to officer and commanding rank? Believe it or not, this continues until the Cardwell reforms of 1871. There's a government commission in 1855 to investigate the practice of the purchase system. It's very negative. The report they turn out is incredibly negative. But, when you win a war, sometimes, people kind of think, okay, whatever, problem done. We don't have to worry about this anymore. And attention moves on. And again, the mid-Victorian crisis, 1857 is the Indian Mutiny, and everyone's thinking about that, not about Crimea and purchase system. To the point that if you watched our one-off on the Charge of the Light Brigade, Kipling is writing poems about how the veterans of the Light Brigade are now forgotten and in poverty because nobody's thinking about the Crimea anymore. It was a thing that was a big national story, and it just sort of went away for everyone. YouTube question. I'm so glad you were all charmed by the idea of this protest of the snowball fight. I do want to mention, why we know that this happened? Karl Marx wrote a letter about it. So our kind of correspondent of learning about this is Karl Marx, who hears about it. He didn't see it. So just a little Marx Easter egg there. Again, something I had to remove from the later episodes because we had to get through so much material. I do want to say there's a charge by the Heavy Brigade earlier in the Battle of Balaclava that is very successful. Charging cavalry at guns is not necessarily a dumb idea. It can be done effectively. You want them to attack the artillery's flank. Cavalry can, in some ways, are good for attacking artillery because the artillery can't always adjust its elevation well enough to deal with them. So if you work fast enough and smart enough, it can be a very good idea. One thing I'd never really heard before, because I had, I'd read Flash Minute the Charge and stuff like that. I'd never really understood how kind of the heroes of the Charge of the Light Brigade are the French cavalry who engage so that the Light Brigade can get away. And that it's interesting that that's kind of been memory hold. Episode 5, patron comment by that one. U.S. observers in the Crimean War also came away with new opinions on the use of cavalry. Their limited use and events like the Charge of the Light Brigade convinced many in the U.S. Army that cavalry was becoming obsolete. This is partially why the Union didn't have a very large cavalry force until near the end of the Civil War. Interesting comment. Yeah, there were a lot of observers in Crimea, and lots of people looked at what was going on. The intro scene of episode 5 was going to be this incident in January 1855 where a hurricane hits the Crimea, and it's, just smashing the Allied fleet in Balaclava Harbor, and their hulls are grounding together. And, inland, these poor troops are lying down on the tents that are the only shelter they have because the tents are about to blow away. And, they're kind of huddling in these very isolated, bombed out buildings to try and get any respite from the weather. It's one of those things that if you had it in a novel, it would almost be too much, And another thing that I had to pull out of episode 5 is a lot of and again, if you watch that documentary, a lot of our source for kind of the feel of the Crimean War and things like that comes from a diarist named Fanny Duberly, who was a wife of a Crimean War officer. He was in the Light Brigade. And she keeps these really amazing letters and amazing diary and then publishes it after the war. And again, she was going to be in this intro, and I was sad to pull her out because her writing is very, very good. And someone left a comment that I'm just going to read. This is an odd fact, but I have seen Nikolai Pirogov in person. His embalmed corpse remains in a mausoleum beneath the chapel in his former estate, now museum in modern-day Ukraine. His expansive work in medicine is still respected to this day. He is seen as a heroic figure for saving so many lives. Really interesting, albeit morbid, to see a part of history like that in person. You have no idea how this is very much my specific thing. I have a new little point on the map that I need to go to now. I absolutely want to go see this. I don't know if it ranks as highly as seeing the skeleton of Jonathan Wild at the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons, but seeing a skeleton that is purported to be London's most infamous crime lord is always going to be like my number one most amazing historical experience. But this sounds pretty awesome, and I'm a huge, history of medicine fan. So thank you for telling me that. I am going to be doing some Google searching after this. Coming up on Extra History, we've got a history of Buddhism. Next time, it's really neat. It starts with the life of the Buddha, kind of more legendary stuff. We try and mix in what was going on in India religiously at that time. And then we talk about its spread throughout Asia. And we essentially track it from India to Japan. After that is Henry Ford. I am so excited by this series. It's really, really interesting and fun. There's not a lot of extra history topics that when I finish them, I still want to read more about that topic, and Henry Ford is one that I'm going to be reading about Henry Ford for quite a while. After that, The Little Ice Age. I'm partway through writing it. It's going to be a really fascinating series. And right now on our Patreon, we're going to be voting on a women's history topic, and the suggestions have been very cool. We might be seeing a Hildegard von Bingen series, which I would love that. Ibn Battuta's side trip. Let's talk about the Crimean War and social media. Everyone kind of understands that the recent war in Ukraine has very much been like a social media war that everyone is tracking via Twitter and Facebook and things like Telegram and WhatsApp. But the Crimean War was this also, but it was by telegraph. By the end of the war, by the siege of Sebastopol, there had been telegraph lines laid that would get news to London, Paris, even Dublin within about a day of it happening, sometimes within hours. And people would hang out. We think of like media addiction as a thing that we experience now, but they did that at that time too. People would hang out at the telegraph office. They would know a battle was going on today. They would know they're storming the Malakoff, or there's a large engagement being fought in this place or that place. And they would go and they would hang out at the telegraph office and just wait to be read out these short messages of whether the battle was won or lost, or casualty estimates, and there is this kind of weird social media addiction that you already see then. So people are not really that different. We are all we're different. We are different, but there are definitely similarities. Our brains are basically the same they were back then, including, the ability to get hooked on real-time information. So thanks so much for hanging in. I really enjoyed the series. See you next time with History of Buddhism. Bye.
What if I told you that Ahmed Ziad Turk, Angela Valenciana, Arclight Games, Casey Mustra, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blaine, Kuya Koi, and Skylar Holmes were all legendary patrons? I'm not kidding.